So yeah, so the upcoming holiday, of course, of Shavuot. I just heard. I think when I was coming on, I heard several people saying that Shavuos is their favorite holiday.
I said that. It's my favorite holiday.
Excellent. I'm happy to hear it. It's a good choice.
I think it's a great.
Shavuos, according to Chazal, it's the most important day of the year, obviously, and without that day, the whole world would return to chaos. That's what the Gemara says, commenting on Yom Hashishi. So which we say in the beginning of Bereshis, referring to the transition from Erev Shabbos to Shabbos. So Chazal say that Hashishi with a Hey Hayidiyah refers also to the 6th day of Sivan, because the 6th day of Sivan is the most indispensable day in the life of the world. If not for Kabbalah Satorah, the whole world would have been returned to a state of tohu vavohu. So it's a good choice. I applaud your...
Get more in today's world with all the Mishagas we have going on, right?
100%. True. Okay, so let's begin. So I want to speak a little bit about what it is that we are focused on Chag HaShavuos, and especially the transition that takes place from Pesach to Shavuos. The reason we speak about that is because that's what the Torah really chose to speak about, and surely that is significant. I'll explain. So if we, there are marmakomos. I was a little late getting them in because I had some unexpected, delays, but they should be. Sheila's been very conscientious, I'll say. She'd been, sending me notes saying that even if I get them late, she would be able to put them out. So, excellent, perfect. So I want to thank Sheila for her patience, in addition to always being so helpful, but being very patient as well. Okay.
She's the best.
She is. So, so the... if you look at the Torah in Parshas Emor, we always do this every Chag. We have a tradition, in this year that, before Yom Tovim, and even some of the D'Rabbanan or Divrei Sofrim holidays, that we always try to have a shir in preparation. And typically I begin with Parshas Emor because it's the main Parsha of the Moadim, and it's so rich. It's, organization, the language, everything about it. It's the divine text. It's the Rabboni Shalom speaking about the Moadim. What could be better? So I always begin with Parshas Moadim. And of course, when it comes to Chag HaShavuos, what's particularly striking about this particular Moed is the fact that it's practically camouflaged. And we've talked about this in other years as well. We're not going to talk so much about why tonight. We've done that in other years. But it is practically camouflage. If you compare Shavuos to any other of the Chagim, every other Chag has a name, right? Chag HaMatzos, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Zikron Trua, actually in Parshas Emor, Yom HaKippurim, Chag HaSukkos, right? Chag HaShavuos has no name. It has no date. Every other Chag has a date.
Well, you don't have to market the Torah. The Torah doesn't need anything else. I'm saying that makes sense, right?
Cool. Okay, that's a great point, except that, it's not only a question of marketing. You would want to tell people, do we need to market our share? Probably not, but we do tell people when it's going to happen, right? You send out a notice saying, what day, what time. There's no date. There's no name, and there's no explanation of what.
Well, that's because it's connected to Pesach. Okay.
What?
That's because it's a continuity from Yetzias Mitzrayim.
Okay, that could be the pshat, but let's see in a moment. So what is the pasuk? What is the pasuk in Parshas Emor that speaks about Chag HaShavuos, about which I've just made the statement that that it is not expected in name and date and in. It's hard to hear a little bit. 1 second. So that is Perek Chav Gimel. Look in Vayikra, Perek Chav Gimel, and look at the psukim, and you'll see exactly what we are, referring to. So the pasuk in question is the pasuk of starting from pasuk tes vav, Usfarta lachem mimakros hashabbos miyom aviachem es haomer atnufa sheva shabbosos temimos tiena ad mimachros hashabbos hashviyos tispru chamishim yom v'ikravtem mincha chadash al Hashem. That's pasuk tes zayin. If everybody has the marmakomos here, that's great. Mimosh vosechem taviu lechem tenufa shnayim shnei esronim soles tiena chametz teofena bikurim laHashem v'ikravtem al lechem Shivak kvasim b'nei b'nei shana par ben achad be'elim shnayim, right? Yiyu ola l'Hashem umin chasam v'nizkem ishay reach nichach l'Hashem. Asisam seiri zim l'chatas shnei kvasim b'nei shana l'zivhei shlamim ve'nif hakohen osam al lechem abikurim tnufa l'fnei Hashem al shnei kvasim kodesh yiyu l'Hashem la'kohen. So all of this is a description of the karbonos that are brought after counting 50 days. So far, there's not a mention of any kind of Yom Tov. Then comes pasuk Chaf Aleph. This is the pasuk which finally speaks of this as a holiday. Ukrasem be'etzem hayom hazeh, in the middle of this day, right? You pronounce Mikra Kodesh Yelachem Kol Melechas Avoda Lo Sasu. And then a very enigmatic pasuk that follows. So basically, in all of Parshas Emor, the only pasuk that speaks about the Yom Tov of Shavuos just says pasuk Chaf Aleph, Ukrasem be'etzem yom hazeh mikra kodesh, kol melechas avoda lo sasu, kukas olam b'chol mashosechem u'dorosechem. You can see that I didn't exaggerate. There's no name, there's no date, there is no explanation of why it is that we are doing any of this. What then is there, and why is it a moadim? The answer is a little bit what Jacob mentioned before. It's obvious based on the Torah's presentation, even though it isn't obvious at all conceptually, that instead of focusing on the holiday of Shavuos, right, the Torah instead focuses on the transition from Yitzias Mitzrayim and the holiday of Chag HaMatzos to the holiday of Shavuos by virtue of its, discussion of two korbanos, the korban ha'omer, which is brought on the second day of Pesach, and the korban shtei halechem, which is brought on Shavuos. Most of the psukim that deal with Shavuos deal with the korbanos, and especially the centerpiece, the korban shtei halechem, which is brought of chametz on this holiday. Now, it's interesting to note that, as we've discussed previous years, we're not going to discuss that part of it, the Ramban already notes this, that mostly karbanos are not discussed in Parshas Emor. It's very rare for the Torah to speak of. The main discussion of karbanos on a Yom Tov is in Parshas Pinchas, in Bamidbar. Parshas Emor speaks about speaks about the Yom Tov itself, Chag HaMatzos, Zichron Trua, Yom Kippurim, Chag HaSukkos, it speaks of twice in terms of the Sukkah, in terms of the Dalaminim. It's mostly practically only, with respect to the Korban Omer and Korban Shtei Halechem, that this Parsha of Emor deals with Karbanos. And that is strange. Like, why is that? Moreover, the Ramban gives an explanation, but it's a difficult explanation, so I'm going to pass that by for a moment. There's a very fascinating Gemara in Masachet Psachim. So if you look here in the Mar Makomos, again, we're still on page 1. So the Mishnah says in Psachim, on Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis, Chamisha Dvarim Ba'im B'Tumah. There are 5 things five karbanos, which even if there's a state of ritual impurity, will still be brought. And what are they? The Eina Nechalim B'tumah. You can't eat them B'tumah, these karbanos, but you would bring them even though there's a state of tumah. What are these 5? Ha'omer, right? The korban Omer, brought on the second day of Pesach. Shtei Alechem, the korban Shtei Alechem brought on Shavuos. Lechem Aponim. The Lechem Aponim was the bread that was put out every Shabbos and stayed there for a week until it was replaced the next Shabbos by the next of the 2 marachos of the bread. Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur refers to the 2 kvasim, the 2 animal karbanos that accompanied the korban Shtei Alechem on Shavuos. They are also not nechal b'tumah, but brought b'tumah. Useirei Roshei Chadashim. Today's Rosh Chodesh. Was Rosh Chodesh. Is Rosh Chodesh. Still a little bit Rosh Chodesh, right? So the seirim, the goats that were brought on Rosh Chodesh, that also can be brought if Klal Yisrael, the majority of Klal Yisrael are b'tumah, you'll still bring that korban. HaPesach sheba b'tumah, the nechal b'tumah, shelo ba tchilasa el achila. In the case of korban Pesach, not only will you bring it b'tumah, but you'll also eat it b'tumah, because korban Pesach is very focused on the mitzvah of achila. Okay, so what does this Mishnah establish? Excuse me. The Mishnah establishes very clearly that korbanos, tzibur, a public korban, is going to be brought even if Klal Yisrael is b'tumah. Meaning, typically, tumah, ritual defilement or impurity, is able to disrupt the bringing of a korban. However, in a korban tzibur, these public korbanos that we're talking about, the Torah, hints that they're brought even b'tumah. Okay, now the Gemara wants to explain, how do we know that? What is the source that you can bring these public korbanos even in a state of ritual defilement? So the Gemara says, Chamisha lemutei mai. What does it exclude? Lemutei chagigas chamisha asar. A korban chagiga, which is also brought on the 15th day of Nisan, that would not be brought to tumah. The sokatai chamina, given the korban tzibur kvia lemoed tidchetuma, since it's also korban tzibur, and it has to be brought at a specific time, you might think, under all conditions, even b'tumah. Kamash malon kim dislei tashlumin kalzayin lo dokisha. You have 7 days to bring that korban, and therefore you can, it's not doka Shabbos, it's not doka tum. Says the Gemara, mid Shabbos lo dochi tum. Then the Gemara says, v'nisni nami sira regalim, atani le zivchei shalmei tzibur. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole Gemara. There's one thing I want to get out of this Gemara. And that is that the Gemara ends up suggesting that the phrase which defines Parshas HaMoadim, Vaydaber Moshe es Moadei Hashem el Bnei Yisrael, that phrase comes to teach you only about the Korban HaOmer and the Korban Shtei Alechem, that they are brought Tumah. Okay, look in the next paragraph. How do you know that they're all Docha, Shabbos, and Tumah? Because they're called Moed. Moed means...
I thought it was going to be here.
You have to do it on the date. And the date, no matter what. The Tan Rabbanon, Vaydaber Moshe, Modeh Hashem, Tamid Lomar, Shalilabanu al-Tamid, Upesach, Shenemer b'Moado, b'Moado afilu b'Shabbos, b'Moado afilu b'Tumah. Shar Kabbalas Tzibur Minayin, Shenemer Eila Tasul Hashem b'Moadechem. In a different parsha. Minayin l'Rabos, Omer, v'Hakarevimo, Shtei Alechem, v'Hakarevimam, Talmud Lomar Vaydaber Moshe Modeh Hashem Bnei Yisrael Hakasuv Kivao Moed Echad L'Kulam. So what the Gemara says here in Psachim is sensational. We're all familiar with, again, the Psukim in Parshas Emor, right? Vaydaber Moshe Modeh Hashem Al Bnei Yisrael. That's how the parsha ends. It sounds like that the reason we have that pasuk is to teach you about all of the Moadim. But according to this Gemara Psachim, Vaydaber Hashem es Moadei, Vaydaber Moshe es Moadei Hashem. Moadei Hashem means Korban Omer and Korban Shtei Alechem. Is a Korban a Moed? Well, since this parsha, now let's put together two pieces of the puzzle, right? The only holiday which is not mentioned by name, which is not given a date, in which there's no description of what the purpose of the holiday is. All it says about it is Mikra Kodesh, Komalakas Avoda Lo Sasu, and Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh. Is the only holiday treated that way of all of the Moadim is Chag HaShavuos. The entire parsha that relates to Chag HaShavuos revolves around what? The Korban HaOmer, which begins, what happens at Korban HaOmer? That's when we begin Sfiras HaOmer, right? Until you hit the 50th day, and then you bring the Korban Shtei Alechem. So in the Tkufa, in the period of Sfiras HaOmer, right, which is marked by the Omer, Korban HaOmer, and the Korban Shtei Alechem, right, that is the Parsha, right? It's even introduced. Look at Pasuk Tes, in page 1 here. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, Daber b'nei Yisrael marta alehem ki savo ala aretz. Daber b'nei Yisrael marta alehem is an introduction. When you come to Eretz Yisrael, there's going to be a Korban Omer, and it only goes all the way until the end of the discussion of Shavuos and Korban Shtei Alechem. So instead of speaking about Chag HaShavuos, the Torah opts instead to speak about what? The bracketing of the entire period, starting from the Korban HaOmer and completing with the Korban Shtei Alechem. So the second part of the puzzle is the Gemara says that the words used in the Torah, Vayidaber Moshe es Moadei Hashem el Bnei Yisrael, are coming to teach you about the moed, quote unquote, of Korban HaOmer and Korban Shtei Alechem, meaning of this bridge between the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. These are considered to be aspects of the moed. The Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, has a very fascinating idea, something we've discussed over the years, and that is that the period of Sfiras HaOmer, the period between Omer and Shtei Alechem, is almost like Chol HaMoed, meaning it is almost like when you have on Sukkot, you have the first day is Yom Tov and the last day is Yom Tov, Shmini Atzeres. And on Pesach, you have the first day is Yom Tov, and then the last day of Shvi Shel Pesach, the day of Kriyas Yam Suf, is a Yom Tov. And in between Sukkot and Pesach, what do you have? Chol HaMoed. Says the Ramban, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says something very similar. The period between the second day of Shavuos and Shavuos, the period that is demarked by the bringing of the Korban Omer and the bringing of the Korban Shtei Alechem, is also a kind of Chol HaMoed. It's a Chol HaMoed of Sfiras HaOmer. So if you want to understand Shavuos, right, and the Torah tells you nothing about it here, Mikra Kodesh, Pe'etzem Hayom Hazeh, Kol Malachas Avoda Lo Sasu, instead of fretting and focusing on what is missing, what do we need to do? We need to go back and understand why the Torah is emphasizing so much the bridge between these two korbanos, the bridge between these two holidays. The emphasis then is on the preparation rather than the focus being only on the anniversary of Matan Torah. So, in order to understand that a little better, I want to zero in on Sfiras HaOmer as a process, as a way of progressing towards, from, Yetzias Mitzrayim to Maimed Har Sinai and Matan Torah. So it's interesting. I want to discuss two phenomena. The first one is the language of the Torah of Tamimos. So if you look here in Pasuk Tezvav, the Torah says, "Usfartem lachem macharas Shabbos miyom haviachem es omer hatrufa sheva Shabbosos Tamimos tieno." Right, 7 Shabbosos that are pure. Now the term Tamimos right, is a very rare term in the Torah. Where else do we find this phrase? Only when it is packed with significance. For example, when the Torah wants to tell us to be scrupulous in our belief and our devotion and our commitment to the Ribono Shalom, what does it say to us? Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Be tamim. When the Torah wants to describe the perfection of the Torah, what phrase do we find in Tehillim? Torah Hashem timima b'shivas nafesh. So the phrase tamim, right? When Torah wants to describe the special qualities of Yaakov Avinu, right, which obviously ultimately qualified him, right, becoming the ultimate exemplar of Avodas Hashem. We're all Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Yaakov, who is the combination Tiferes of Chesed and Gvura, of Abraham and Yitzchak. Kisarisa ima lokim v'ima nashim vatuchal. Right? What is the quality that the Torah identifies as the quality of Yaakov Avinu? Ish tam yoshev ohala. Right? When the Torah wants to say something nice about Noach, what does it say? Tamim haya b'doros. And when it speaks about Avram Avinu, right? Hishalech lefanai v'hayei tamim. And that's, of course, the pasuk that is used also in context of a bris milah, right? So the phrase tamim or tmimos, right, or tmimim, is certainly a very aspirational phrase. And that's how the Torah describes the counting of the Omer, the bridge between Chag Matzos and Chag Shavuos. Usfartem lechem imachros hashabas, miyom haviachem es Omer hatnufa, sheva shabasos timimos tiyana. What does the Chazal interpret? What do they learn from this word timimos, which is a very rare usage, and I'm trying to suggest a very elevated usage as well. So if you look on page 2 for a moment of the Mar Makomos, you will see that Talmud Bavli Masechet Menachos Samach Vav Amud Aleph. Everybody have that or can see that? Okay, good. So the Gemara says, Imi Yom Haviachem Yochol Yiktzor V'Yispor V'Yavi Bayom. You might think that you could do Ketzira Sa'omer and Sfira Sa'omer and Havoa Sa'omer during the daytime. Talmud Lomar Sheva Shabasos Timimos Tiana. Emasaya Tamotse Sheva Shabasos Timimos Bizman Shatamat Chilimanos Miba Erev. The Gemara says that the reason that we count Sfira Sa'omer at night, and according to some, there are some views that the only time that we paskin this way, count with a bracha is at night, right? That's a very rare halacha. Mostly the day is what, is the main, part, of a sanctified day. It starts at night. But for example, the mitzvah of lulav and the mitzvah of shofar, right? All these things are bayom. Sfira, so Omer, the sfira is supposed to take place, and with a bracha, it needs to take place at night. How do we know that? So the Gemara says in Menachos, because of the phrase timimos, Shava Shabbos is timimos tiyana, ematzai atamotze. How do you get perfection? Meaning, how do you not skip a beat? How do you maximize the sfira? If you start from day one, and every day you add a piece from the very beginning of the day. Bizman shatamatchil limonos mi ba'erev. Very strange halacha. The Bali Tosfos discuss this question. If you look at Tosfos Menachos Samach Vav Aleph, not the next one, but the one after in Bar Malkomos, Zeicha Mikdashu. The Gemara says, "Near the besafek chashecha yachal levarech, vein tzorach lahamtin ad shehe vaday laila, kivin shu sveika d'Rabbanan." When is the proper time to count Sfiras HaOmer? So the Gemara says, you would think it would be when it's certainly nighttime, which is Seisa Kochavim, and maybe that is preferential, which is what we do. However, Bali Tosa say, in their opinion, Sfiras HaOmer Bizmanenu is only Drabanan. Since it's only Drabanan, so if you count at Bein HaShmashos, right after Shkia, before it's Seisa Kochavim, it's Safek Yom, Safek Laila, but since it's only Drabanan, Sfeika Drabanan Lakula. So B'diavad, you can count, according to the Bali Tosis, if Sfiras Omer is Drabanan, you can already count from Bein HaShmashos. But then Tosis says something fascinating. Va'od Omer, Ta'afilu b'yom samach l'chashecha adiv, mishum t'mimos k'narmin la'el. Because there's a concept of t'mimos, of maximizing the count, and each and every day of counting in the very beginning of the period and the beginning of each and every period. So Tosis is weighing the possibility that you could even count Sfiras HaOmer, not just at Bein HaShmashos, but even a little before, so that by the time you've counted, it's before the new day. And then Tosis says, that seems wrong. Ve'einira and if you didn't count at night, pasak bahag shasofar bayom, you still count during the day. This is our practice. V'cheina yanir mitok stam masnisin desov pirkin, the tam mitzvasa balayla liktzar v'mniktzar bayom kasher. Aval nir l'rbeinu tam ikar idach stam de masnisin de perak sheni de megillah umaisi besof pirkin. Kol halayla kasher l'tziras ha'omer, v'daikina mina diktani layla dumi diyom, ma diyom b'layla lo, after layla b'yom lo. So there's a view of Rabbeinu Tam that if you don't count at night, you don't count. Rabbeinu Bereish Moed Katan, Rabbi Gamliel Beizino Nimno Al Gimel Prakim, V'hitiru, Masik Ravashi Hasam, the Savala Rabbi Shmuel, the Darish Machorish Rishus, Avkatzer Rishus, Yatzik Katzir, Yatzik Tzir Omer Shu Mitzvah, V'daki Shabbos, V'kim the Daki Shabbos, Ein Nixar L'Balayim, Kinemuchach B'Sov Pirkim. Okay, so Tosa is trying to prove that even b'diavad, you cannot count other than nighttime, because nighttime is considered the beginning of the day, and the beginning of the day is a way of establishing tmimos. Okay, but we don't paskin this way, but this is the view of the Baal. Okay, the Bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolos, has a more radical view, and this we do paskin mostly like. If you look at the bottom of Tosis, the last line, Tosis says, Od pasak b'halachos gedolos, shem hifsik yom echad, v'lo safar, shuv eino sofer. Mishum deboy t'mimos, v'tema gedolahu, v'lo yitachein. Okay, so the position of the Bahag, I'm going to stop for a second for questions, just to make sure that everybody's able to hear. But the position of the Bahag is that if you miss a day, like let's say you count the first 10 days, every night, you're very diligent. You count day 1, day 2, day 3, all the way till day 10, and then for some reason you skip day 11. So according to the Bahag, you can no longer count with the bracha. You can really no longer count. Why? Because of this principle of tamimos. It has to be maximal. It has to be perfect. You can't miss. Either because the Bahag thinks that it's one mitzvah that stretches
That's a machlokas, right? If it's one long or a mitzvah each day.
Well, that's what we're talking about right now. That we're talking about the Bahag now. Yeah. So the Bahag is of the opinion that if you, well, put it this way. The Bahag is of the opinion that if you skip a day, then you lose the count. The Balitosis, as you see, say Tema Gedolahu v'lo yitachein. They disagree. Balitosis hold that even if you miss a day, you could continue the count the next day. So there's actually a double argument between Tosas and the Bahag. Now, there are two explanations of the Bahag. Let me explain. So there are two arguments. One is the view of the Bahag, the view of Balitosis is that if you don't count at night, right, then you can't count during the day either. Whereas the Bahag is of the opinion that if you don't count at night, you should count during the day, albeit without a bracha. Or b'diavad, you can count during the day. In that sense, the Bahag is Mekel and the Balitosis is Machmir. However, if you skip a day, that's where the Bahag is Machmir. He says that you lose the count. And the Balitosis are Mekel. They think you could continue with the count. Our practice, of course, is somewhere in between. What we do is, if you skip a day, you continue the count without a bracha, right? But you don't make the bracha. So that's a nod to both the Bahag and the Balitosis. Well, what's the point of all of this? What emerges is that the Gemara only says that Tamimos means that you start counting at night. And what I'm trying to show is that now there are several dimensions to this problem. One is, when should you start counting? Only at Seisa Kokavim, when everybody agrees it's night? Or even Ben Hashmashos, or even a little before Ben Hashmashos, in order to get the purity of each day in. So that's one argument.
But everyone agrees you can't say a bracha during the day, right? Everyone agrees to that.
That what?
That you cannot say a bracha during the day.
Correct. So, although again, it's not so clear, the Bahag might think that you could say a bracha during the day, although l'chatzchila you should say it at night. But we paskin that you don't say it. We paskin like the Balitosis that you don't say a bracha during the day, and we paskin like the Bahag that you don't say a bracha if you skip the day. We combine those two things. But the idea is that the Gemara applies the principle of Tamimos only to the fact that you count at night and not during the day, unlike, let's say, lulav or shofar, right? It's right at the beginning of the day. You want to get you want to maximize, Sfiras HaOmer. That's the Chiddush of the Gemara. And then you have an interesting argument. You can't even b'diavad do during the day. That's one argument. What if you skip a day? Can you count the next day with a bracha? That's an argument. What is this idea of Tamimos? Why would it be, that we're so makbid, dafka at night, dafka at the beginning of the night, etc.? Very interesting question. And the question that Tosas raises, maybe you should even begin. Tosas says you could count Sfira after Ben Hashmashos, because we hold Sfiras HaOmer as Rabban. The Rambam happens to hold that Sfiras HaOmer, even Bizman Hazeh, is Doraisa. Rambam Hilchos Tmidin Musafim, Perek Zayin, says to counting the Omer, even in our time, even without Karbanos, is Minan Torah. And therefore, the general view is that according to the Rambam, you would have to wait till Tzeisa Kokavim, right, when it's Vaday Laila, in order to fulfill this mitzvah. But it's interesting to note that the Taz, this idea of Balitosis, that because of Tamimos, maybe you have to start earlier, even L'chatchila, not just B'diavad, is quoted by the Taz. If you look here on page, just for a minute, we're going to get back to it. Look here on page 3. Everybody have that? Taz Orachaim Simin Taf Pei Tes Sif Katan Hey? Yes?
Shtiga Kodadam, yeah, that's a good sign.
says you. So the Taz says, Baran Kosav, Sphira Hashtaleka Elamidrabanan, like Tosas, Kivin Deleka Hava Velo Karban, Mishamachi Tov Lispor Bayom, Echa Besafek, Chashecha, Kadeshiu Zayin Shabbasos Tamimos Lagamri. Says, therefore, it's better to count actually during Ben Hashmashos. The Ein Zanachon, Shiachnis Atzmo L'Safek L'Chatchila. B'Mishum Tmimos Ein Lahachmir B'Zman Hazeh Elakosha Sofer B'Layla Tmimos Karinameh. So this is again the Taz is quoting views that say that the requirement of Tmimos not only tells us night and not day, not only tells us according to some that you can't make the bracha at all during the day, not only tells us according to the Bahag that if you skip one day of bracha, that you are, you've lost the count. It also tells us that it's actually better to start counting at Shkia, which is Bein Hashmashos, than at Tzesa Kochavim. And the Taz disagrees in the end. Oh. So what I'm trying to prove here, basically, is that there are four different issues or expressions beyond the Gemara of Tmimos. The Gemara takes Chazal and the Halacha take very seriously this use of expression in the Gemara, Sheva Shabbosos Timimos Tiena. And they just argue what its implications are. Let me go a step further. Typically in every Yom Tov, almost every Yom Tov, a couple of exceptions, we apply and every Shabbos, we apply the principle of Tosefes, right? I'm sure that in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue at this time of the year, right, they don't start davening Friday night Bisman, right?
On Yantif you're talking about.
Well, I'm talking about Shabbos at the moment. When do they daven?
Shabbos we start early. That's been what the show's always done.
Well,
Friday night.
Start.
In the summers.
I know. What time?
Now it's 7:15.
Okay. So 7:15, of course, is early. It's well before the Zman. That's based on the principle of Tosefes Shabbos. And most Yomim Tovim have Tosefes Yom Tov as well. There are two exceptions that are known, or where one is Shmini Atzeres, because Shmini Atzeres, if you bring it early, it comes on at the price you're sacrificing. You're diminishing, right? You're depleting Chag HaSukkos. So you have to be careful on Shmini Atzeres. This is a debate between the Taz and the Marshal. At least the Marshal thought that you can't bring Shmini Atzeres early, because to do so is to clip the wings. It's to cut off time from the chiyuv of Chag HaSukkos. And therefore there's no din of Tosefes. That's Marshal's argument. The Taz disagrees. The other one, of course, is on Pesach, because it says Ba'erev Tochel Matzos. And the understanding is Ba'erev, that it's really got to be nighttime. And that the normal principle of Tosefes Yom Tov, right, will not apply in this discussion. What about Daled Kosos, and what about Matzah? And what at least about Kiddush of Daled Kosos? Can you do that early or not? Some people think that the first night of Sukkot also you have to wait because of Tesvav. There's a comparison between the night of Sukkot and the night of Pesach. But all things being equal, otherwise, when it comes to Shabbos and Yom Tov, we have a principle of Tosefes. So in the late 14th, early 15th century, some of the poskim, as far as I know, that's the first time it was suggested, came up with the idea that we should delay, we should not apply Tosefes Yom Tov to Shavuos either. Right? Why? Based on the principle of Tamimos. Since it says Sheva Shabbosos Tamimos Tienaf, so just like you want to start right from the beginning every night, maybe even before the beginning, Samuch, right, Lishkia, or Shkia Natzes, according to some, right? so too, you don't want to end too early. But it's very fascinating because Chag HaShavuos, Yom Matan Torah Seinu, the day of Gilui Shechina, is a day that the whole world was waiting for. So it's a very striking thing that with all of that anticipation and all the stakes that are connected with Matan Torah and this holiday, that you're not going to apply the principle of Tosefes Yom Tov, which is an expression of that kind of anticipation based on Tamimos. The Taz applies it to, I believe, to Kiddush. The Magen Avraham applies it even to Mariv. And it's a practice, I even, Medayik, Jacob, from what you said earlier, that, in the Fifth Avenue synagogues, also they have the practice to wait and not to begin Shavuos until the Zman. So what we have is a very quixotic use in the Torah, the word tamimos, when all the other tamimios or tamims, as I say, in the Torah are very lofty. They imply a lot. Tamim tiyam Hashem alakecha, Torah Hashem tamima. Again, statements about Noach and about Abraham and about Yaakov and about Bris Milah, all associated with this term tamim and tamimos. And then you have the Gemara, which says, this is why it's an exception. Really, the Ikar is Balayla. Maybe it's Ikar Balayla, maybe it's only Balayla, maybe it's only if you don't skip or if you have one integrated period. Maybe it starts even at Ben Hashmashos or earlier, and maybe it eliminates or precludes Tosefes Yom Tov. So Tamimos is establishing numerous halachos even beyond what the Gemara says. Remember, there's only one Gemara that speaks about it, Gemara Menachos. The rest is the discussion of the Rishonim, of the Mefarshim, of the Poskim. They were very taken by this idea of Tamimos. And the question again is, why exactly? But in order to explain this, I want to zero in on one more factor. And that is the category of sphira itself, of counting. This is not the only time in the Torah that the Torah uses the expression Spartan, that you count. We actually had the same phrase in Parshas Bahar, just not this past Shabbos, but the one before, right? Namely, in connection with the Yovel. Torah says that you count, Sheva Shabbos, Sheva Shanim, Sheva Pa'amim, right? 49 years, and the 50th year is the Yovel, right? And the Torah uses the expression, Usfartem Lachem. There's another sphira in the Torah, and that is when there's a certain ritual impurity, right? Tumas Zava. So the Torah also says, V'safra Lecha. You have to count 7 days. The woman who has this condition, right, in order to become tahar, has to count 7 days. So the concept of sphira, safra, right, is not limited to Sfiras HaOmer. However, it can be demonstrated that Sfiras HaOmer, right, is distinctive. It stands out. It's not operating according to the canons, according to the rules of the other mitzvos of Sphira. The Bali Tosas already discussed. In V'safrala, does she really have to, why doesn't she make a bracha? Maybe she should make a bracha. They give different reasons. The general consensus view is that there's no bracha on Sfiras Zava. When it comes to Yovel, there's more of a controversy. There's actually Machlokas HaRishonim, in the mainstream, whether Bezdin is obligated to count the years of Yovel, right? Like to proclaim them and to make a bracha as well when they do. And they're obligated to count. The question is, are they obligated to make a bracha or not? Some Rishonim say yes. Others say no. There's a very fascinating chizkuni in Parshas Bahar. So look here on the bottom of page 2. You see this chizkuni in Vayikra, Parshas Bahar. The Safarta Lecha Sheva Shabsos Shanim, says the chizkuni, Lefi she'ein kan ela sfira achas, the strange chizkuni. The chizkuni says there's only one time in the Torah that the Torah proclaims that we have to count Yovel. V'hi bebezdin, ein tzarich levarich. Since it only has one counting, the counting of Bezdin, so therefore there's no reason for a bracha. Aval Omer, dichsiv be'shtei sfiros, but when it comes to sfiros Omer, where the Torah mentions the count twice, the Parshas Emar, achas b'Parshas Emar, b'achas b'Parshas Re'eh, achas lebezdin, b'achas letzibur, once referring to the Bezdin, right, and the other by each individual member of the tzibur, therefore tzarich levarich. Very interesting chizkuni. What does the fact that the Torah mentions Sfiras HaOmer twice, and that it's diffused, that one of them is for the Bezdin and the other one is for the the Hamonam, every individual, what does that have to do with whether there's a bracha or not? But either way, what emerges according to the Chizkuni is that the Sfira of Sfiras HaOmer is fundamentally different, not only from Sfira Zava, which we can understand is very different, right? You're just counting days, which need to elapse before you can, undertake the process of Tahara. But that's very different than these other counts. But the count of Yovel, the count of 7 weeks and 49 days, from Pesach to Shavuos are much more comparable. And yet the Chizkuni says there's a fundamental difference. One has a bracha, the other doesn't. And he links that to how many times the Torah speaks about it and how many populations, the Bezdin and the Tzibur, are obligated. What does that mean? What is that all about? Oh. So before we get to that, another difference between Sfiras HaOmer and other Sfiros, which I believe is connected. And that goes back to the Gemara. Look at the Gemara, also on page 2 in our Gemara Makomos. The Gemara says Gufa, very famous. Also Gemara Menachos, Samak Vav Oman Aleph. Gemara says Gufa. Amar Abaya, mitzvah lemimni yomi, u'mitzvah lemimni shvui. There's a mitzvah to count days, and there's a mitzvah to count weeks. Rabbanan de Beravashi, mani yomi, umani shvui, right? A Meimar, mani yomi, a Meimar only counted days, velo mani shvui. Why? Amar zecher lemikdash. As he said, it's a zecher lemikdash, and therefore we don't have to do the whole thing. Okay. So we're going to leave out the implication and the discussion of a Meimar for the moment. That's not for us today. But as we know, we do have the practice of being Mamani Yomi and Mamani Shavui. And that also sets Sfiras HaOmer apart from other Sfiros. In Zava, of course, there's only 1 week, but you don't say, it's Shivas Yamim. You don't say Hayom, Shiva Yamim, Shem Shavua Echad, B'Sfira Zav. And when it comes to Yovel, there's also no din of Sfiras Shanim, and Sfiras Shvui, or its equivalent. So why Dafka and Sfiras HaOmer do you have this double count? Now, the truth is, there's also a lot of very interesting discussion around this double count. For example, do you only count the weeks at the end of each week? Or do you count the weeks every single day? We have the practice of counting the weeks every single day. We say Hayom, right, I'm not going to say the right amount today, but you say Hayom, whatever the day is, and then you break it down how many weeks and how many days. But there was a practice that you would only mention the weeks at the end of the week. And then the question is, well, when you mention a week and it's at the end of the week, do you also mention the days? X amount of weeks and days, or only weeks then? Meaning, there's a lot of discussion about the details of how to combine weeks and days. Not only that, Rabbi Yerucham, one of the Rishonim, discusses whether or not, there aren't maybe two mitzvos. One focused on the days and the other focused on the weeks. Maybe the two parshios and two psukim, in Emor and Re'eh, represent two different dinim, and it discusses maybe you could have counted them separately in the mitzvos. The Beis Halevi has a version of this when he discusses, whether or not if you mess up the count, according to the Bahag, who says that, as we discussed earlier, that if you skip a day, that you can't count with the bracha anymore. So the Beis Halevi wants to know, is that only Yomi or is that even Shvui? Could you possibly distinguish between them? The point I'm trying to make is that Sfiras HaOmer, in addition to having the requirement of Tamimos, which is, replete with all sorts of interesting implications given that phraseology, and which is associated with numerous detailed halachos having to do with some sort of like a preferable focus during the Sfiras HaOmer. Do it as early as possible, make it as complete as possible, start, as early or even before the beginning, don't skip any time, even if the goal is to anticipate Shavuos in the end, right? It has to have consistency. If you skip a date, you're out. It has to maybe be only at night, not during the day, maybe even before the day. In addition to all of its Tmimos halachas, what I'm trying to show is that Sfiras HaOmer, as a sphera, as a count, defies any kind of analogies, certainly to Zava, but not even to Sfiras Yom. And that's why, according to some, there's no bracha, including the Chizkuni. But even aside from that, the fact that there is a double, that there's a Memani Yomi and a Memani Shavue, and then discussions even about those two, whether they don't represent like two different themes, two different mitzvos, whether they're nafkamina b'ta'ah be'echad. All of this seems to highlight that Sfiras HaOmer is a singular mitzvah, and by extension, if that's all we know about Shavuos, that somehow the preparation for Shavuos, right, is unique. Let me mention one other phenomenon, which I think is very important and which is related. So far, we've talked about Tamimos, and we've talked about the concept of Sphira. Let's talk about a third aspect, and that is the role of the bracha itself. Right, in our discussion just now of Zava and Yovel and the Chizkuni, we're saying that Sfiras HaOmer, gets its own bracha. But what I'd like to try to demonstrate is that, at least according to some Mefarshim, the bracha of Sfiras HaOmer also defies typical analogy. The bracha on Sfiras HaOmer is a birchas hamitzvah. Right, we make a bracha on many mitzvahs. Lulav, Sukkah, Shofar, right? Many mitzvos, Birchas HaMitzvah, Mila, Pidyon Haben, right? There's something called Birchas HaMitzvah, and we do it quite frequently. However, when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer, it's interesting to note, at least according to some Mefarshim, that the bracha takes on or assumes added significance. And that is very striking. The way that it does that is striking. What do I mean by that? So let me demonstrate it in a couple of ways. Firstly, let me note an interesting discussion already in the early poskim. There was a girsa that when you say the bracha of Sfiras HaOmer, you should say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvosav v'tzivanu al Sfiras HaOmer, and then you should continue and say Shehayom, and then say the day. In other words, instead of doing what we do, which is you finish the bracha, everybody says Amen, right, to each other's brachos, right? And then you say Hayom, and you say the name, the day. There was a nusach that said that you would continue as if you're continuing the bracha and say Al Svirasa Omer Shehayom, meaning not a bracha, bracha mitzvah, psik, stop, now comes the mitzvah, but like a seamless integration, almost as if the bracha is part of the sphira, or the sphira is part of the bracha. Shehayom. One word can make a big difference. Shehayom. And some of the other poskim say, like, why would you do that? Right? Even if you don't do that, which most people think you don't, but we'll get to the Ha'ara, the Gra, in just a minute. There was a view in the Rishonim, this is very important, that on the last day of Sfiras HaOmer, we're getting very close to it. I'm not going to tell you where we are right now, but we're getting close to the last day of Sfiras HaOmer, that the minhag is on the last day of Sfiras HaOmer, when you count it, you finish, you say the bracha, you say the day, right? That's the 49th. That will be the 49th day of the Omer and the 7 weeks of the Omer. And then you say Shemacharaso or Macharaso Yom HaShavuos or Chag HaShavuos. Right? Not in the bracha, exactly, but in the nusach. And that's also very fascinating. The Sefer Chinuch quotes this, and other Rishonim quoted Chachmei Sfarad. Very interesting idea. Okay. Now, the idea that you would say that you would integrate the bracha with the sphira or the sphira with the bracha, is very fascinating, and we'll get back to it. But one of the things that's fascinating, first of all, we don't do this in other brachos typically, but in addition to that, we should note, and this is going to be important for another big issue, that the bracha is very generic to the count, all things being equal. And this would change that completely. Meaning, you say the same bracha every single night, even though you count a different number. Like let's say last night was the 12th of the Omer, and tonight is the 13th, and tomorrow is the 14th. You're still saying the same bracha, pashtus, the same nusach habracha, asher kedushanim tosef tzivanu al sfiras haomer, each and every night. But if you change it and you say shehayom, if you say asher kedushanim tosef al sfiras haomer shehayom, and you think that is like a way of integrating these two, one into the other, whichever order or both, then it's almost as if you're particularizing the bracha. It's like you're saying that every night there's a different bracha, because part of the nusach of the bracha includes the difference in the count. So let me highlight this, in a much more controversial issue, or one not so controversial, and then the other one very controversial. So look in the Mar Makomos that we have here on page 3. On the top of the page, this is Shulchan Aruch Siman Taf Pei Daled Seif Hey. Everybody got that? Excellent. Whoever's doing the, who's manipulating the, is that Sheila?
Sheila.
I'm telling you, Sheila knows the whole shir. Okay, she's doing a great job. So Sif Hey is Im Einei Odea HaCheshbon. Let's say a person is counting the Omer. This happens all the time for sure. He's counting the Omer and he doesn't have a clue. He's in shul, right? Upasach hadaita dilasayim k'moshe yishma mechaver. He doesn't have a clue, but he's in shul, and he figures, he'll stand next to his friend. He'll start, and his intention is to give the right day, whatever it is, but he'll find out as he's listening to, or over listening to his friend. So he doesn't know the cheshbon, but he doesn't have the wrong cheshbon, right? So it's a data de l'sayim k'moshe yishma mechavero, the shasak ad sheshama mechavero, and then he waits till he hears it then from his neighbor, to see him kamo, and then the guy says shlosha asar yom laomer So he says Shlosh Asar Yom LaOmer, and it's correct. So the Shulchan Aruch says Yatsa. That's not so simple, but it's also not so controversial because, like, why wouldn't he be Yotze? Right? The bracha that he makes is generic anyway. You say that bracha every night, no matter what the number. Right? So he'll make the bracha. He doesn't have a clue. Right? He'll say Hayom, and then he's listening, and then he'll say the right number. But what's interesting is that, is there any lechatchila that he shouldn't do this? Aside from the fact that he might hear the wrong thing or not hear. So look at the Taz, Orach Chaim, Taf Pei Tes Sif Katan Hey. No, I'm sorry, Sif Katan Ches. The Siyam Kamo Yatza, not the last entry on the page, but the second last entry on the page. The Siyam Kamo Yatza, Mashma B'di'evet. Aval lechatchila lo yivarech ad sheyeh lo birur b'shas habracha kama tzarich lispar achar kach. So the Taz says something very interesting. Taz says this is b'di'evet. Lechatchila, when he shouldn't make the bracha unless he knows the right day. And if you look at the Chok Yaakov on Shulchan Aruch, the Chok Yaakov quotes earlier authorities who disagree with this Taz. They say, no, it's not b'di'evet. There's no reason why he can't do this. What's the difference? I mean, the bracha is generic. What does that mean? There seems to be a debate whether or not, even though the words of the bracha are generic, whether or not al pidin, whether legally the bracha is generic, or the bracha relates specifically to that date, in which case it would be preferable before he begins for him to know what exactly he's saying instead of relying on fill in the blank. Fill in the blank is a problem. Fill in the blank is not a problem if the bracha is generic. But if fill in the blank is a problem, if the bracha, even though the nusach is generic, is considered conceptually to be specific. Everybody with me? People can hear and people understand? We have a little bit of different screens, so it's hard for me to, yeah, okay. I'm going to assume the answer is yes. Just like, so basically, what I'm suggesting is, there is a view that you say, Shehayom. What does that do? It makes the generic bracha, the general bracha, specific. Mostly we don't paskin like that, but we'll see in a moment, it has an echo. That's an interesting idea. That's one. Then comes number two. Let's say he doesn't know, he hasn't identified the day in advance. Do we care about that at the time of the Amira Sabracha, given that it is klali, it's general, right? That's a debate already in the poskim. So we have 2 points of argument, whether or not we look at this bracha, which is general, as integrating specifically to its day, yes or not. Okay. A third issue. And this is the one which is most interesting. The source for this issue is in Chachmi Ashkenaz. It's an insight of the Rabbi. So if you look at the last page, page 4, we're going to go backwards a little bit for a second, but look at page 4. Okay, the last entry says Rabbi Chelik Beis. Everybody have that? Yeah, exactly. So listen to this. The Rabbi wants to talk about the following case. First, I'll tell you what it is, then we'll read it inside. Let's say a person, not the case that we just discussed, but a very interesting similar case, but a little more extreme. Let's say the person started making the bracha thinking it was the 4th day of the Omer, but really it was the 5th day of the Omer, right? So this could, does that matter or not? If you have the wrong, before we were talking about, you don't have anything in mind at all, you just don't have a clue. You're going to fill in the blanks. That's one argument. Now we're talking about the next, step of acuity, of difficulty. Namely, when you start the bracha, you have the wrong day in mind. But by the time you finish, you remember and you got the right day. Certainly by the time you count, you get the right day. So let's say it was really the fifth day. You started thinking that was said Baruch Atah Hashem, thinking it was the fourth day. And by the time you finished, you're thinking that it's the fifth day. And it is the fifth day. Does the Chasimas HaBracha determine or the Psichas HaBracha determine? Or let's say the opposite happened. You started off thinking that it was the fifth day, which it is. By the time you came to the Chasima, you were thinking it was the fourth day, which it's not. Is that a problem or not? And let's say you actually said the wrong day, right? So then you counted improperly. That would certainly be a problem. But would you have to repeat with a bracha, or would you just repeat the count? Because the bracha is the same. Either way, whether it's the fourth day or the fifth day, aren't you still going to say the words Asher Kedeshanu B'Tzosav V'Tzivanu Al Siras Ha'omer? So as you can see, this is a little bit of a complicated question. But the key to think about here is, again, this general bracha, worded in a general way, to what extent does it relate, does it integrate into the specific date? That's question number one. Question number two, are there any precedents in Hilchos Brachos for this kind of an issue? So the Ravya speaks about, now look at the text of the Ravya. He started off thinking it was the fourth day. The Siyam B'Chamisha, he ended up, by the time he ended the bracha, he was correctly thinking it was the fifth day. Vayomu Chamisha Yamim, and it really is. Inami, what about the opposite? Arba Yamim, right? Hu Hayom, right? Miazlina Basar Psicha. Do we go by the beginning of the bracha? Ukeshayom Chamisha Yamim Lo Nafik, and therefore, if he said he was thinking 4 and it really is 5, he won't fulfill the mitzvah. The Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Hu Ikar. When he said those words, he had the wrong thing in mind. Therefore, he shouldn't fulfill the mitzvah. O Dilma, or perhaps, maybe we go by the end of the bracha, and he will fulfill, because inami, the opposite case, imu arba yamim ayom, if today is 4, so the Rav Yos, an equal opportunity post-sell in this case. Rav Yos says, I think both of them do not fulfill the obligation, right? If you don't have the right bracha in mind from beginning to end, right, then you will not fulfill the obligation of the sphira with a bracha. Why? You need both. How does he know this? Who gavna the brachos? The answer is it's a Gemara in Brachos, says the Rabbi. Now we're going to see if it really is. Nokat kasa de shichra, the savar de chamrahu. A person is about to make a bracha on beer. There's a cup of beer sitting in front of him. He's about to make a bracha. What bracha do you make on beer? Boy, everybody's so quiet today.
Shakol.
Excellent. So he's about to make a bracha on beer, which should be shahakol, correct? But the savar de chamra, it looks like sparkling, wine or something. So he thought it was wine. Upasach ubirech adaita de chamra. So when he starts the nusach habracha, he's thinking wine. But v'siyam b'deshechra. But he finished correctly. Mahu. That's the Gemara Safek on Daf Yud Beis and Brachos. Basar psicha azinon olo v'lo ifshata. The Gemara doesn't resolve it. V'hachanami ilu siyam adaita de psicha lenafik. Dotoi b'cheshbon. So the Rav Yah says the same thing. In both cases, one is wine and beer. This is the 4th day and the 5th day. the same issue. The kiva the sphera daraisa, he disagrees with Tosas. He agrees with what we call Shita Sarambam, that sphera Omer daraisa. Azlina nechomra. V'tzorich lispor v'lachsor v'levarech. The bracha is only drabanan. Afagav the bracha lav daraisa. The kiva the sphera daraisa v'tzorich lispor lav milsei lispor b'la bracha. They can bracha levatala. So let's say it this way for now. Is this a good comparison or not? A person's making a bracha on Sfiras HaOmer, and he makes a mistake in his mind about the date, either in the beginning of the Psichas HaBracha or the Siyum HaBracha, the Chasimas HaBracha. And the Rabbi is telling us it depends on the Gemara and Brachos, where Pasach b'dechamra v'siyum b'deshachra, where the Gemara has a suffix, exactly the same suffix. What does the group think? Is it the same, or is there a glaring, prejudicing this a little bit?
Glaring difference. I mean, you make the wrong bracha. We're saying to make the wrong bracha on food compared to making a bracha on the wrong date. Is that what we're asking? Just to be
Correct.
clear.
What's the difference?
The difference is when you make a bracha on the wrong food, you're completely, unless you do shakol, you maybe your head, but it's a completely, you're in like the wrong universe. Like you're,
Correct. Correct. Excellent. Very good. Meaning, in one case, you're about to make the wrong bracha. Not just a bracha on the wrong. It's a different nusach bracha.
I disagree. I think
that would be the equivalent of instead of saying a bracha for sphera, you make a bracha on something else.
Yeah, you make
right?
a bracha on
You make a bracha on a different count, whatever.
Correct. I agree with you. Meaning, who said they disagree?
Oscar.
Oh, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, I am well. I think the important part of every bracha is the praising of Hashem.
Okay.
The second part, the element of definition, is tertiary.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, the fact is that if you praise in your bracha, and let's say let's say you're about to drink beer, right? And you make a bracha borei pri agafen. Everybody agrees that that's a mistaken bracha, and you'd have to make the bracha over again. By the way, if you make a bracha on wine, shahakol ni'amed varo, as the Rav Yah goes on to say, b'di'eved, that would work because everything is shakol ni'amed varo. The Mishnah and the Gemara and Brachos explain that if you formulate a bracha, you're supposed to try to be as specific as you can. But if you make a mistake by being more by saying something broadly true, that's good enough. But yeah, so for example, if you're eating a fruit and you say shahakol, or if you're eating a fruit and you say borei pri adama, right, which is typically what you say in a vegetable, but these are more you're making a more general bracha instead of a more specific bracha or yotze. But if you do the opposite, like you're trying to make a bracha on beer, right? And you make the bracha for wine, you don't go too general, you go too specific, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So it's not, the ikar part of the bracha might be the praise, but it still requires some precision. So Jacob's point is absolutely correct, in my opinion, is absolutely correct, which is, in the case of the Gemara and Brachos, we're talking about, it's true, the words you said are generic. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. You didn't get to Shakol ni'amed varo or borei pri agafen yet, but the point is that these are words that are going to be concluded with two different brachos, right? If you keep on the same path. So the question of the psichas habracha, the chasimas habracha, and their accuracy, when we're talking about two distinct brachos on two distinct food substances which require different brachos, that's the Gemara and Brachos. Can you compare that to day 4 and day 5? Well, the Rav Yah does. So it's fascinating is the comment of the Vilna Gaon. So this halacha, by the way, gets codified in Shulchan Aruch, or before we get to the Vilna Gaon. So what is the Rav Yah's assumption, if he is equating these things? That even though the Nusach HaBracha is the same, every night you're going to say, Asher Kedushanim Tosav Tzivanu Al Sviras HaOmer. So it sounds like, this is the problem, it sounds like whether you say Hayom Arba Yamim or Hayom Chamisha Yamim, that's zero impact on the bracha. That's why, by the way, the Chaf Yaakov, right, said, if you don't know what the night is and you just want to start making the bracha and then you're going to listen to your neighbor, he said that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Probably because of this reasoning. It's the same bracha either way. The only difference is in the counting. By the time you're doing the counting, you know what you're saying. You don't need to have in mind the day number in the bracha because all day numbers get the same bracha. But obviously, this is where the Rav Yah disagrees. The Rav Yah thinks that even though technically, right, the formulation of the bracha is the same, every day of Sfiras HaOmer, right, the bracha relates specifically to that day. How could that be? Well, probably that's why the Taz says that even though b'di'evad you can listen to your neighbor, l'chatchila, when you make the bracha, you should know what you're saying. Moreover, I mentioned before that there was a girsa that said that you add the words shehayom, right? Asher kedushanim b'tosav tzivanu al sviras ha'omer, shehayom yom arba shehayom arba yomim la'omer, shehayom chamisha yom la'omer. If you add the shin, just one letter, but if you add the shin, then in a way what you're doing is you're changing the note. You're saying even most of the words of the bracha are the same, but really the bracha is relating very specifically to the actual individual count. So the Gaon of Vilna puts those two ideas together. Look at the Bir Agra on top of the Rav Yah, right? Bir Agra Orach Chaim Siman Taf Pei Tes Sivav, the second to last entry on the same page. He says, Eina Chozer v'chulei. You know, before we do that, I'm sorry. I'm going to go back a page just to show you that the Rav Yah, which is medieval Germany, his discussion gets into the Shulchan Aruch and triggers huge debate among the poskim. So go back for a minute to page 3 and look at Seif Vav. Everybody, the second entry on page 3. We'll try to wrap this up in a minute. In Pasach v'Amar, if the Gefeller began by saying, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam adaita delema hayom yom daled, thinking it's the fourth day, shehu savar shehem daled, because that's what he thought it was. The nizkar, the siyam behei, either he heard his neighbor say hey, or he remembered in the middle, can't be daled, it's hey. Behem hey, it really is hey. Oh, ipcha, shehem daled, it's really daled. Upasach adaita delema daled, b'tov v'siyam behei. Eino chozer mevarech. This is the din of the Rav Yah. Except the Rav Yah paskind that in both cases you're chozer mevarech, because he thought it was like safek doraisa, and even though it's a bracha d'Rabbanan, you repeat. You don't repeat. Repeat. Yeah, the Shulchan Aruch says eino chozer mevarech. You don't repeat. So two things. Number one, wow, the Shulchan Aruch went a giant step beyond the Rav Yah. The Shulchan Aruch says even if you said the bracha, the whole bracha, and then after you started with Daled, you finished with Hey, right? And then you counted Hey, and it's wrong. You actually counted the wrong bracha. You counted wrong. That's okay.
What if you said the bracha and left out the day entirely, stopped because you were uncertain?
Well, then you didn't count. I mean, at some point you have to say the day, because otherwise you're not counting. Right? The Maisa Mitzvah, the waving of the lulav here, the blowing of the shofar is the counting. The bracha is just, well, I'm trying to show it's more than that, but
You do say Sfirat HaOmer, right?
You said Al Sfirat HaOmer, but you have to say the day. So, but the way the Shulchan Aruch seems to say is, it's day number 4. You started thinking it was day number 4, but by the time you got to the middle, you thought it was day number 5. And then you said, Hayom, Chamisha Yamim Laomer. And he said, you're not Choser. How can you not be Choser? So I think the answer is, according to the Magen Avram explains, well, I mean, you will be Choser on the Sfira, you just won't be Choser on the Bracha. Look at the Magen Avram. He says, Im Shachach Levarech Be'echad Me'ah, I'm sorry, Magen Avram Taf Pei Tes Sif Katan Yud Beis says Ubach Pasak Bazeh the Choser Mevarech. The Bach says you have to make the bracha again. Tarei Omer Sheker. He's saying it's day number 5 when it's really day number 4.
And what if he just says the day without the bracha? Hayom Yom.
That's great. That's a great point. The answer is b'diavad your yotze, as long as it's the right count.
Keeps you in the game.
The bracha is not ma'akev, yeah. The Chain Dasa Poskim, you can understand the Bach. The Bach says, hey, counted wrong. How could that be okay?
The whole mitzvah is to count. I don't understand the question. You count wrong, you didn't count. I mean, what kind of? I don't understand the question.
You don't understand the Bach, or you don't understand?
I don't understand the Havamina that when you count wrong, you should get credit for counting the wrong day when the whole mitzvah is to count. Yes.
Right.
I don't understand. I don't understand.
So I'm going to get it to a second. The Bach says he disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch. Bach pasak the choser mevarich. You have to repeat the bracha. Dari Omer Sheker, he lied. He didn't lie. I mean, he didn't lie on purpose, but he said a false thing. V'chein dasa poskin siman reish tes. V'chein kasa b'levush. However, says the Magen Avram, he's going to try to explain it. Miu nirali the eno choser mevarich. He says no. The Shulchan Aruch didn't mean that. The Shulchan Aruch meant, let's say you did this, right? Let's say it is the 4th day, and you ended up saying it's the 5th day, right? So the Bach says you have to make the bracha over again. So the Magen Avram says, no, you don't have to make the bracha over again. It's not a problem. You just have to count again. Rak yispar shenis. Bracha achad yatsa achar kach elam kain hifzik harbe. What's the Magen Avram saying? He says like this. You made a bracha. What bracha did you make? Asher kedeshanu b'mitzosav tzivanu al sfiras ha'omer? Right? Wouldn't you make that bracha anyway? What did you do wrong? Did you do wrong the sfira and the bracha, or just the sfira? The Bach says, if you messed up on the sfira, then you have to repeat the bracha, because the bracha, even though it's a generic bracha, it attaches itself to the sfira. So it's as if you made a mistake in the bracha too. Says the Magen Avram, no, that's what the Shulchan Aruch is telling you. That's wrong. The Shulchan Aruch is telling you the bracha is generic. It applies to all the days. What you have to repeat is not the bracha. The bracha is fine. What you have to repeat is what? The sfira. So what's that argument? It's the same argument, but we're seeing again and again, we're seeing in 5 different issues. Some of the poskim think that because the nusach of the bracha is generic, asher kedeshana b'mitzvos of tzivah, you say that every single day of the 49 days. The only thing that changes is the count. So you didn't mess up the bracha, you messed up the count. Repeat the count. But the Rav Yo is saying, the Rav Yo is saying it's like pasach b'deshachra v'siyam b'dechamra. It's like beer and wine, meaning it's keilu, the proper day is connected with the bracha. So that's what the Bach and them are saying. You can't just repeat the count. You have to repeat the bracha, because the bracha that you made was connected to an improper count. Maybe even as a bracha. So that's why the Gra, now look back at the Gra. Back on page 4, we're going to finish up in one more minute. Everybody see the Bira Gra or Chaim? Yeah. Second last entry. Ubetur Kasav b'Shem Rav Yashi Varech v'hu b'Divrei Mordechai Sof Perik based in Megillah. The Kasav the Kiva the Nishar Abaye b'Sof Perik Kama de Brachos Vazino Nechumra. This is a discussion in Brachos about wine and beer. Kemosha Kasav Sham the Perik Gimel. Safek Omer v'Misviyatzi v'Chanami Sfira do Tzrias Omer Daraisa Kozer Mevarech v'Sofer. The Kasav Beis Yosef of Kasav Rova Poskim Sfira le Sfira Bizman Azed Rabban. Then he says, "V'divrei Ravya hein geshitas Rabbeinu Yonah shehevi arash, aval arash kolak alav v'chein ator yoredeya v'chein kam mekomos pasak Rambam v'shulchan aruch lo yivarech v'chein divrei Tur Beis Yosef kan tmui." Skip a little bit. 1 second. Oh, now go 4 lines from the bottom. The Efshar Shazeu Tam Shel Ravya Gamkein Lefia Nuscha Shalahem Shekasav Lomar Besfira Shehayom Umashma B'Divrayim Sheusiyam Abracha V'chein Mashma B'Dvarav Anal Shekasav B'Pasach B'Dalad V'Siyam B'Hei V'Lakasav V'Siyam Adayta Dehei. What does the Gra do? Something brilliant. The Gra says, remember that there's an argument whether you say the word she, you add an ed shein, you say she hayom. He says, oh, it's the same argument. Says the Rav Yah, who thinks that even though the bracha is the same text every single night, it attaches itself to the specific day. That's because he thinks, probably like those who think that you should say she hayom, which takes the general bracha and gives it a specific target. Okay, so let me sum up here and then come to the final conclusion. What have we seen? That even though Sfiras Omer seems like a mitzvah like any other mitzvah, with a bracha, there seems to be a lot of evidence that we treat the generic bracha of Sfiras Omer as if it is a more indispensable part of the counting, as if it's integrated with the actual day. The sphera needs the bracha needs the sphera. And the question is why? So I want to go back to the Chizkuni for a moment, and this will explain, what we began with. It's just reinforcing what we began with. What did the Chizkuni say? Chizkuni said, you don't make a bracha on Yovel, because the Torah only has it once. And it's the bracha of the tzibur. But Sfiras Omer, there are 2 parshios, Re'eh and Emor. And there are 2 groups counting, the Bezdin and the individual. And now I'm going to add. And not only that, we count weeks and days, even though we clearly know, through the weeks or through it's superfluous. I mean, if I say, it's 9 days, I don't need to say 1 week and 2 days, which are 1 week and 2 days. I mean, we all know what that is, right? But we're Mamani Yomi and we're Mamani Shvu. And according to some, right, there are actual halachic, maybe there are 2 mitzvos, maybe it matters if you make a mistake. And not only that, but we're so specific, right, about these, that there's not only a bracha, but the bracha is, according to many, integrated into the actual sphera, which it isn't in other mitzvahs, something comparable to that. So what's going on? So I think what the Chizkuni means and what we're encountering in all these phenomena is the following idea. When you tell somebody that there's a mitzvah of sphera, right, there are 2 ways to explain it. You count things in order to establish, unequivocally, to remind people. You count in order to make a proclamation. You count in order to anticipate, right, in order to ward off any potential error. There are many reasons to keep account. We count many things. But typically, none of those would justify a bracha because they're instrumental, right? They're a means to an end. You want to make sure you don't get the wrong date. You want to anticipate. You want to proclaim formally and publicly. So whether it's Sfira Zava or Yovel, right? There's no bracha, according to the Chizkuni, at least in Yovel, because it's not an intrinsic count. It's an instrumental count. What the Chizkuni is trying to say is, if Sfiras HaOmer had been an instrumental count, then we wouldn't need to mention it twice, once in Parshas Re'eh and once in Parshas Emor. And there wouldn't be a need for it to be accomplished Al Yidei Bezdin and Al Yidei Atzibur. The very fact that it's mentioned twice, and the very fact that there are two different populations at the same time who are making this count, all proves one single thing. And that is the count in Sfiras HaOmer is not instrumental, it's intrinsic. What we're really saying is that every single day matters. And what we're saying is that the different ways that you look at the count, whether it's counting up or counting down, whether it's counting in the smallest increments, every single day, or the units of a week to mark a different kind of, progression, all of that is not instrumental. We know where we are, and we know, where it's going to end. You don't need any of this for that. The counting is all about progressing every single day incrementally, right, in bigger and in smaller units, preparing, transitioning from Yetzias Mitzrayim to Kabbalah Sator. And the numbers, of course, are highly symbolic. The 7 and the 49, and so on. That's not for now. Numbers of Shabbos, numbers of Yovel, etc. But the idea is that this isn't counting time, and it isn't even, as I say, securing, the date, to make sure about it, count it every day. It's really about substantive progress, substantive preparation, as I say, that takes place in different units along the way. And that progression is different for Bezdin, who speaks for all of Klal Yisrael, and for Usfartim Lachem Kol Echad V'Echad. The poskim suggests that even though normally we apply the principle of Shomea Ka'oneh, maybe there's no Shomea Ka'oneh in Sfiras HaOmer, because there's a din of Sfira L'Kol Echad V'Echad. There's a collective Sfira of Bezdin. There's the individual Sfira, right? Klal Yisrael needs to progress as a unit, and each individual to be ready for Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeisicha, B'lashon Yachid, referring to each individual, but also referring to the unity, Ki Ish Echad B'Lev Echad, of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, Dafka and Sfiras Omer, there's a bracha, as reflected by the two parshios and the two populations, etc. But because of that, the bracha takes on greater significance, and the bracha relates to every single day separately, even though the nusach bracha is identical in each day. You couldn't discern the difference. Nonetheless, there's an invisible shehayom, and for that reason, it's better, according to some poskim, to know the day, even when you're making the bracha. And for that reason, for other poskim, it's really comparable to Pasach B'Decham Ravasi and B'Deshachra, even though those are two different nuskei bracha. But for all intents and purposes, conceptually, the bracha of Sfiras HaOmer, followed by each day, which is separate, is almost the equivalent of in an integrated way of a bracha and the sphere. And if that's the case, then we can also appreciate the different perspectives and why the Torah uses the expression Tamima, because this is all about Tamim Tiyam Hashem Elokecha. It is all about Torah Hashem Tamima. It's about being an Ish Tam, a Yoshev Ohalim, or, his Halech Lefanai, the Hayei Samim. this is really about Klal Yisrael, right? Building from, practically being on the threshold of spiritual extinction and being a slave, nation with a slave mentality, as Ibn Ezra so forcefully describes it, right? To becoming, B'nai Chorin, who can be osek b'Torah b'mitzvos, and who can be worthy to greet the Ribono Shel Olam and to respond to him on the day of Gilui Shechina, Yom HaShishi, the day for which the world was created. And the only way that can happen is through Tamimos, through a plan which has integrity, in which, it's complete, it's comprehensive, it starts from the very beginning of the period and the very beginning of every single night for each, mini unit, maybe even at Bein Hashmashos, or at least at Seis HaKochavim, but at least only at night. And according to the Bahag, unless you do the whole thing, you've done, you've either broken the rhythm or you haven't done the full, preparation, and then you're lacking. And for the same very reason, there's no Tosefes Yom Tov for Chag HaShavuos. Because if the whole point is a transition from the Omer to the Shtei Alechem, reflected by the Chol HaMoed, the Sphira of Sfiras HaOmer, and that's done every Yom, every Shavua, with the bracha, and the bracha is relating specifically to each day, then to skip a step, to lose a day is a problem, but also to jump the gun to greet Chag HaShavuos before the Sheva Shabbosos Tamimos Tiena, which is the methodology of preparation, has been completed, would be counterproductive. It looks like anticipation, but in the end, it's a jumping, ahead, which undermines the meticulous, rigorous participation, which is exactly what preparing for Shavuos and Matan Torah is all about. So I want to wish everybody a
Yantiv, Rabbi, thank you so much.
Sameach.